Hey everyone, looking to step up your photography? If you have ever used a handheld DSLR, you most likely have used the automatic settings. Shooting in manual gives you much more control over how your shots look. Whether you choose to shoot in manual settings or not, it's always great to be able to understand these concepts of how your photos are captured. A few key concepts we're going to go over are some of the basic terms, camera settings, and we're also going to focus on how lenses are important to your photos. So let's get right into it. You may not believe me when I say this, but when it comes to DSLR photography, your camera lens is often more important than the actual camera you use. In general, using a cheap camera with a high-quality lens will most likely give you better photos than if you use an expensive camera and the free party favor lens that they throw in the bag when you bought the camera. Think about it this way. When you take a photo, a bunch of light passes through your camera's lens, which then hits a sensor inside of the camera. If you have a cheap lens, that light is completely affected in a different way before it even gets inside of the camera. That's why taking high-quality, professional photos requires quality lenses. Now we're going to look more specifically at the camera lens itself. Camera lenses are really just a bunch of curved pieces of glass, and the number of pieces varies. However, most lenses have essentially the same parts. There's the iris, or the diaphragm, focus, aperture, and zoom rings, its corresponding lens mount, and of course the actual glass. There are a couple special numbers and words that come with a lens that describe what it can be used for. These are its focal length, its speed, whether it's a prime or zoom lens, and the lens's mount type. First, the focal length will tell you how wide of an image the lens can take. You can think of this as a measure of field of view, which is how much stuff can fit into the frame of your picture. The numbers are a little counterintuitive when you first look at them, however. For example, here is an image taken with a lens that has a focal length of 28 millimeters. As you can see, there's a wide field of view in the image. However, as you go up in number, the lens more or less zooms in. This image was taken at 150 millimeters. Next, and possibly the most important, is the speed of the lens. This is in relation to how much light the lens lets in. As we mentioned before, the camera lens has an iris. This is a series of little blades that open and close to let more or less light in. This lens speed, which is commonly referred to as your aperture, is a measurement of how closed down this iris is. Now this aperture measurement is usually a distance between the blades. However, since lenses may be big or small, it doesn't make sense to use this number on all lenses. Therefore, the speed of the lens is showed as a ratio. This ratio is between the distance of the blades, or the aperture, divided into the focal length from earlier. Here's an example. Well, we typically don't know how open the aperture is in distance, since the setting you're going to usually change is the actual f-stop, which is that ratio. Therefore, we can solve for that distance. Let's say we shoot a photo that's really wide at 28 millimeters, and then we use an f-stop of f2.8. We can see the aperture is open 10 millimeters. Now, as the f-stop goes up in number, the aperture actually closes. So, f2.8 is more opened than f8. We can see that using f8 gives us a smaller aperture, which would be a darker photo. So how does this f-stop number even apply to the lens? If you look at a camera lens, you will typically see a range of f-stops the camera can use. Since the iris opens and closes, that range describes how much light can be let in. For example, a lens with a lot of range may start really open at f2.8 and close to a really tight pinhole of only f32. However, a telephoto lens may have a very small range, possibly only f5 to f6.3. Now, as mentioned before, the f-stop controls how much light enters into the camera, which will make images appear darker with a larger number or brighter with a smaller number. Therefore, you would typically use a small f-stop, such as f2.8 at night or outside, in cases where you don't have a bunch of light. However, another very important property that can make your images have more character in them, regardless of the brightness, is the depth of field. As I mentioned earlier, all lenses have a focus ring. Turning this ring will change the focal plane of your image. If you focus on an object very close, that object will appear more sharp or in focus than objects that are far away. Objects that are far away will typically appear blurry. Now your depth of field will affect how much of your image is blurry. For example, if you have a ton of depth of field, not a lot of your photo will appear blurry since most of the objects are within that range. However, if you have a very narrow or small depth of field, only a few specific objects or even portions of objects will appear in focus. Everything else will be blurred out. The amount of depth of field is controlled again by how open your aperture is. Next is the type of lens you're using. This one's pretty simple. A lens that lets you zoom is called a zoom lens, and a lens that doesn't let you zoom is called a prime lens. Finally, the lens mount type. Sadly, not every lens mounts on a camera the same way. If you're using a camera made by Canon, all of your lenses are either EF, EFS, or FD. Nikon uses F-mount lenses, which work all the way back from the 60s. Pentax uses K-mount lenses. Now, if you're going to shoot professional video or even cinematography, you may use lenses that are PL or micro four thirds mount. However, don't be discouraged by the type of lens mount you have. There are many adapters out there and even fancy ones called speed boosters that help you get more light out of your lenses. Now, I've thrown a bunch of information about the actual lens, but let's move to the settings that you'll typically find on the camera itself. Let's take a look at a couple of these settings on the camera. On this Canon DSLR, you can see when we switch the dial to manual, all of these settings can now be controlled manually by us. The first option we have is the fraction. This is the shutter speed. By changing this number, you control how fast the image is taken. If you take an image really short and really quick, not a lot of light gets resolved into your final image. The resulting image doesn't have much motion blur. You would probably want to use a very fast shutter speed for sports where there's a lot of fast movement. However, if you leave the shutter open for a longer amount of time, say half a second, a lot more light enters your camera over time, and this will give you a brighter image. Using a slower shutter speed will give you more light, but any amount of movement will give your image some motion blur. This is why our lens's aperture from earlier is called either fast or slow. That's because with a very large aperture, say f2.0 or less usually, we don't have a little pinhole restricting the amount of light entering your camera. Which means that if we want to get an image that isn't overexposed or too bright, you'd want to take a picture with a very fast shutter speed, so not a lot of light comes in. The next setting we have is the aperture, which is measured in f-stops. We've already gone over this though. The aperture controls how much of an opening the lens has. The last important setting that we're going to cover is the ISO. Now this setting is a little ambiguous, but you can consider it the sensitivity of the camera sensor. Camera film is measured in a very similar property which describes how fine or sensitive your film roll is, so you can think of the ISO as this. When you take a photo, light comes in from the front of the lens, bounces around, and hits the sensor at the back, which converts those photons into digital information, which then makes up your picture. If you have a more sensitive sensor, then it would essentially take less of those photons to hit the sensor to get a brighter image. If you take an image at night with more sensitivity, then you wouldn't need as much light. The ISO is typically measured in increments from 100 all the way to 32,000 sometimes. A smaller number represents less sensitivity. However, be aware that having a more sensitive sensor has the potential, and usually does, to introduce noise into your images. That about wraps things up. Photography can be a lot more fun than just pointing and shooting. Also, almost all of the settings apply to taking video too. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to let me know what you think. Thanks for watching.